Thank you for your patience. We're sorry about this slight delay, but everything seems to now be working. And of course, most importantly, our speakers are here. The curator of Contour 8, Natasha Ginwala, and the artists, three of the artists participating, who I will introduce in a moment. My name is Nicola Setari. I'm working here at the Villompin on the public program. I've joined the team, which is now sort of managing this new phase for the Villa, together with Asad Raza, the artistic director, and Luma Salame, the general manager. So this event this evening is part of this sort of new phase of the Villa. We're very happy to be able to host this presentation of Contour 8. I'll be saying a few words on the program of the Villa at the end of the talk, so giving a bit of an idea of what's coming up next. It's great to see so many of you here during the Art Brussels days, and having made it here to the Villa. I would of course like to thank the organizers of Contour for having also decided to do this presentation here. I mentioned Steven Opdevik, the director, and his team. It's for me a really great pleasure to be able to do the event here. Of course, having been myself involved in the last edition in a quite in-depth way, and to see that the Contour continues on such a sort of exceptional level is of course a great, gives a great feeling. And I will just again thank you all, thank the speakers. The talk this evening, the title is quite engaging. Reading the Lens, Evidence Today, Fiction Tomorrow. And what can I say again? That we are in the company of Basir Mahmoud, Judy Radoul, and excuse me, I have my names. And of course, Louise Henderson and Natasha Ginwala. Natasha is a curator, researcher, and writer. She's curatorial advisor of the next Documenta 14, so it's quite an exceptional also combination that she's going to be working on in the next year. And her recent curatorial projects include My East is Your West, featuring Shilpa Gupta and Rashid Rana at the 56th Venice Biennial. And she has been doing a project at eFlux called Corruption Everybody Knows, I think recently, a year ago now, a bit less. So that's Natasha. Louise Henderson is a filmmaker whose works investigate the relations between technology, animism, capitalism, and colonial history. His recent works have been shown at the Rotterdam International Film Festival, at CPH Docs in Copenhagen, the Kiev Biennial, and the Centre Pompidou in Tate Modern. Basir explores the sphere of fiction and documentary through video, film, and photography. I think you actually have most of the bios on the paper, so I won't read them entirely. And Judy Radoul's latest work involves an original computer-controlled system for live and pre-recorded video, but her practice also includes sculpture, photography, writing, and performance. Most important, I have to mention that after the talk we will have a performance. There will be a brief in-between moment where you're all invited to have drinks. Sarah Moltalebi will perform Directory of Portrayals, which is an excerpt from her large-scale opera and exhibition Rendering What Remains. So we all hope you will stay with us for this second part of the evening. And yes, I guess I can leave the floor now to the speakers and to Natasha, who I guess will give a little bit more input into the introduction for this evening. Good luck with the presentation and with Contour 8, Natasha, which is going to be a great adventure.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. And again, deep apologies to keep you waiting on this very busy evening with Art Brussels. I'd like to once again thank the foundation hosting us at this fascinating villa, and what feels, importantly, a very compelling mandate for the scene here in Brussels. And we're very much feel lucky to be part of the public program here. And also, while we're about less than a year now from Contour Biennale 8, it is very important to have local partnerships. So thank you, and also to Nicola for the generous introduction to us. So I'm going to just share very quick words about the next edition. And we've also released our design, our graphic identity recently. So I'm going to take you through a few images. And then we move into the artist talk. We actually have more than the 3 artists present today, because we're on our second round of artist visits to Mechelen. So I also wanted to mention that we have Rana Hamade here from Rotterdam, and we also have inhabitants who are between Portugal and New York and currently in the UK. So that's a more extensive view into the artists for the next Contour edition. So in this identity, I'd also like to reveal that I'm looking very much into the framework of justice within the next edition. Justice through the lens of artistic engagement. We've all been familiar with the way in which artists have been investigating into the realm of forensics, have been looking at the conditions in which evidence production becomes a mode of narration, very much into also the question of testimony. Testimony as ways of investigating the present, but also of the complex historical memory that becomes questioned through the cultural realm. Finally, this also links very much with the history of Mechelen, which had the Great Council, 400 years of a juridical legacy. And yet we bring ourselves outside of this court, and in the ruins of this court, think about what is happening amongst us today. What kinds of systemic rupture exists where there was once a regional courthouse. So we're also very excited that among our venues, what we have is the Schepenhaus, where this Great Council sat at some point, and now we will have expanded representations of moving image, performance, and sound by artists from all over the world, over 20 artists. Here, if we could go to the next image, one of the design symbols for Contour Biennale 8 by Studio Remco van Blader from Amsterdam is this Moira pattern, which forms an 8, but it also forms a lens. It forms a forum, a space of gathering. And in this pattern, what you see typically is, for me, also a sense of polyphony, a sense of multiple voices, of speaking in multi-directionality, so that you form a whole that is more than the singular part. And I see that very much as a link with the curatorial ideas as we progress. And also the design for Contour Biennale will, in a sense, progress as we move together as an artistic ensemble. He also, the designer also takes reference from the fugue, and thinking about the sort of 3-part structure, and the fact that you're also chasing images while images flee from you, and what is this kind of meaning production that exists within this realm of the design as well. This is an image of a historic painting that exists. Currently it is in the City Hall, and it was also an important starting point for me to think of this session of the Parliament of Mechelen as a space of gathering, and as a space in which we can somehow move out of the Enlightenment rationality and into a much more empirical mode of experience from our own collective consciousness. And so this, again, was an image that I saw when I walked into the City Hall and started to think about how to use it, how to subvert it, how to produce another sublime narrative with artists today. Okay, with that, I'm actually going to now invite our first participating artist, Judy Radul. And I must say that Judy is also an advisor to me for the Biennale. And it was a work of hers called the World Rehearsal Court, which traveled extensively, that has animated this idea of justice and this realm of testimony of how the court is a theater in its own right. I'm going to leave it here for Judy.
Thank you, Natasha. Okay. Yeah, okay, let me say a few things, Katerina, and then we'll play the video, and then we have some slides. So I'll try to, we have a very, obviously don't want to go on for too long, so I'm going to be very compressed. I did a lot of work about the court of law, not so much about justice, but about just the performative nature in a way of the court of law, which I got interested in because Vancouver built a new courtroom. We had a so-called terrorist trial, and in the basement of our existing courthouse we built a courtroom, and in the newspaper I saw a picture and I realized that it looked a bit like the video studio in our artist-run video collective, and that basically over my research I realized that Anna was corroborated by other academics and lawyers, and that the court wasn't kind of changing from a theatrical literary form in which the spoken word was the the most important thing to a videographic or a audiovisual form, and this is a interesting, difficult transition. So you could imagine that in Canada, for instance, still you can't take a picture in the courtroom. The court takes images very, very seriously. But now you have things like the International Criminal Court where it's all wired up and the whole thing is getting beamed out or live cast to hopefully an audience that maybe is more, that it is meaningful to, depending on the case. Anyways, I got interested in this form. I had done a lot of performance myself, and then I made a large work of art and finally actually edited a book of essays about media, law, court, performativity, and aesthetics. And during this time I realized that I found out that there was a whole branch of thinking called law and aesthetics, which was way ahead of me, and law and literature, thinking about these things, and it was very interesting. So I just show you, there was two parts to this big exhibition. One part was a 7-channel video, and I'm going to show a clip from that, and then I'm going to show just a few slides from the installation. The 7-channel video was 4 hours long, so lucky you'll see just 3 unlife-consuming minutes of it, and then the rest of it involved a lot of these live cameras, which I've worked on ever since, and we invented a kind of custom-made system in which to control the movement of these cameras and keep replaying a kind of choreography of camera movements, so the exhibition is always looking at itself live, which I see as not so much surveillance, but somewhere between surveillance and cinema. The way I wrote the trials, there's 2 trials that are, one is the former president of the 21st Republic, and the other one is the trial of the soldier who pleaded guilty, I think it's called. And I just looked at trial transcripts from international cases and basically used real transcripts. I didn't write any of the dialogue, or however you want to call it. I just took out all the names of people, places, things, religions, countries, and substituted them with other terms. And I tried to find places in the transcript where, in fact, meaning was breaking down. It's not easy to say what happened. And so that was very interesting to me. And so we just watch a little bit, like 3 minutes.
You've made references as well to Energy One. What was his specific role, according to your knowledge? I knew Energy One to be the ISS director for the accused former president. And he was the one who coordinated between Mosquito and Papa. Like most often when Mosquito was speaking to Energy, he used to answer to him, yes sir, yes sir. I used to hear him answer, yes sir, yes sir. And so I could say more or less Energy One was a commander to Mosquito. And who, if anyone, do you know was Energy One's commander? Energy One's commander that I knew was his leader. I can say our former leader, Mr. Accused former president, and he was a CIC. He was Energy One's commander. How do you know that? Well, I was a contact person that liaised the communications after the Lion had spoken with Mosquito. And before Mosquito accepted the ceasefire that the Lion had said we should do, he first consulted with Energy One to get Papa's advice before he accepted, before he agreed with the ceasefire. And even when Mosquito and the Lion still continued the discussion about ceasefire, there was a time that Sunlight intercepted the conversation when the Lion was speaking directly with Mosquito, but Sunlight did not know that it was the Lion who was talking. He thought Mosquito was just speaking to any other commander just like that, or any other person. So when Sunlight contacted Mosquito,
can the witness slow down? I'm completely lost.
Mr. Witness, you have really speeded up this time. You must speak more slowly. And can you please keep to the questions that have been asked you? Also, would you please address your answers to the judges and not to the prosecution who has been referring you with the questions? Also, Mr. Witness, you're thumping your hand on the desk, and it's very irritating.
Mr. Witness, we're almost at the lunch break, but I will ask you if I want a specific example of something. I will ask you for it. I will ask you to further describe something. Okay?
So we just and so I had two parts. So those, if you heard all those little, oops, yes, sorry, I'm a loud voice anyways. If you heard all those nom de guerre there, those were my own substitutions, but that testimony itself involved all these kinds of pretend names nom de guerre that people had taken on. So the rest of it didn't have such far out names as those. So we just look at some few images. This was how that was installed. That was 7 channels. And it was shot, you could see a little bit, it was shot in this kind of complicated way. It was shot in a school, gymnasium, and every so often this whole camera apparatus turned around. So there was 7 simultaneous cameras. And the exhibition had then all these objects, and I suppose my idea was to make something so complex as an exhibition that you couldn't feel you could testify to it, but you'd still feel that there was some meaningful or potentially meaningful connection between what you'd seen on the video and this objects in the exhibition. So it also had this live camera which was on a big track here. One of my personal triumphs was to keep this tracking camera moving back and forth for several months at a time. I haven't done it, I'd like to do some more of that, but anyways, only did it a couple of times. It just gives you, just go through the slides. Yeah, so those were the live images that you were sort of seeing the exhibition looking at itself the whole time. There was an evidence room, there was this book of poetry by Jack Spicer that was somehow really important to me about making correspondences. So the idea was not that something literally means something, but also that the associative way of thinking would be a rich one in this exhibition. Yes, the Ramachandran mirror box for healing phantom limb pain. Is that in the middle? The book. Carry on. More book. Slightly random selection of slides. This was all live, so there was a lot of charming. I find it quite nice, these live cameras, because there's a lot of chance things that happen, and I think that I try to organize the cameras so that I can predict that there may be some nice chance moments where you're standing. But there's something quite different, I find, a little bit of weird alienation or desubjectification when you see yourself, or you see the people you're there with, or you see the exhibition through the lens of the apparatus. I think there's a couple more. Oh, more book. I really loved that book. Oh, we saw it all. Okay, cool. I can quit. I've done my thing. I got 8 minutes. Okay, go. You beat me now.
Okay, Judy, I'm breaking my rule, which was that I would actually go through all of the artists in one go, but I actually feel that it might help to share a little bit about the actual research process, which has involved going to The Hague and really analyzing the International Criminal Court, also in a way as what you described in the extended, in a imaginative way, as a sort of television studio environment because of the amount of media technology in there. And I think this, for the audience, could be something that gets missed within just this section.
Well, just like Natasha said, I did a residency in The Hague, and I went to the court. I also went to court in Vancouver. It's a fantastic thing to do. Anybody can go to court, and in that court in particular, I suppose it was interesting that eventually I went back and met with the people a bit, and in fact it was two guys from TV. They'd started off at the International the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which has, you know, been going on now for so many years, and so many like simultaneous trials, and it's just on and on. But anyways, there were people from television who had set up a way of not documenting, but live casting, because you don't sit in the same room as the judge and the prosecutor for security reasons now. You sit behind a piece of glass. So it's also like the avant-garde theater of Richard Foreman, which I've been to, where he concretized the fourth wall with a piece of glass between the players and the audience. So there was, you know, a lot of parallels, but they were using a very televisual. They continue to use a very televisual aesthetic, which I, of course, wanted to break. But yes, I heard this testimony. That's probably why I picked this particular part. In fact, I heard this testimony as part of the Charles Taylor trial. It's just wild, you know. You're trying to pick out some truth from people's experience. It's very difficult. So, did I do it?
Yes. So we next go to Louis Henderson, and Louis is going to discuss a film project called All That Is Solid, and another film of his, Black Code, Code Noir, is currently on view in Brussels. Today might have been the last day, I'm not sure.
Yes, today's the last day.
Okay, so you missed it?
It was on view in Brussels.
And in terms of this film specifically, was the first work of Louis that I watched, and I was deeply struck by the sort of affinities between us, but also the differences. I've been working a lot around conditions of land use, geology, and colonialism. So trying to move beyond this scientific hemisphere of thinking around the Anthropocene, but actually going back into colonial history, into the plantation, into various kinds of cinematic archives to trace where science and colonial modernity meet. And within All That Is Solid, I find also this interest of Louis, where he talks about the materiality of the internet, the meeting points between technology and geology, the geology of media, essentially, is something that we would want to explore together as well.
Yeah. Me too. I'm going to set my timer so I don't run over. Yeah, thank you, Natasha, for the generous introduction. So this film, and I'm just going to let some slides play in the background. It's a film that I made in 2014, quite simply because of a kind of urgency to make a new piece of work, but working with very limited resources at that time. And prior to making this film, I made another film in 2013 called Visionary Letters. And Visionary Letters was a film that I made in Ghana, which followed the format of a sort of normal conventional, slightly sort of documentary shoot. I went to Ghana with a camera, I spent a few months there, and made a film about these young men that they use kind of animistic powers to physically embody the internet and sort of travel through space and time. They actually use the internet as a form of travel to continue with their email scamming practice as a way to steal money back in their own terms, stealing back the colonial gold that was stolen from them. So Ghana, when it was a British colony, it was called the Gold Coast. So it was a country, well, it still is very rich in gold. There's lots of gold beneath the Earth's surface that's been mined and extracted for a long time, for hundreds of years, still to this day. And so I found that interesting that there were young people in Ghana at the moment that were using the internet as a source to try and extract wealth. And also that they could actually, physically embody the space of the internet. And that was this other film called Visionary Letters. this film here, All That Is Solid, is actually a recycled version of that film. So the previous film was longer, it was 40 minutes, and this film is much shorter, it's 15. And I reused my own footage, or bits or scraps of images that I hadn't used before. So I kind of ended up going through my own archives as such, through my hard drives, looking for material, sort of salvaging scraps of video from a previous film to make a new work. And then the bits of video that I was picking up on were actually images that were shot in this wasteland in Accra, the capital. It's a place called Agbogboshe, which is this enormous waste ground. We just went past it, where again, mostly young men are there breaking down computers to extract precious metals. So when you recycle a computer here in the West, let's say, or in the overdeveloped world, you recycle a computer and it gets sent off and you clean your nice green consciousness and you feel good about yourself. More often than not, the computer gets put into a shipping container and dumped on the west coast of Africa in somewhere like Ghana. But then the Ghanaians there were like, well, you know, great, let's repurpose this junk, let's do something with this. As Ashun Mbembe said wonderfully, the rest of the world hasn't really caught up with Africa yet. And it's perhaps in Africa that we're going to have, you know, examples of future possibilities. And there, going to Agbogboshe, it's really the future. It's this waste ground with mountains of waste from computers and other different kinds of electronic devices. And they're stripping away the plastic and the metal to extract bits of gold, bits of copper, bits of zinc. And from that, they can then make, you know, small amounts of money. It's a very precarious system of producing wealth, but nonetheless it works, and there's a lot of people doing this. And so I was very interested in the relationship that that had with Ghana's colonial history. So, you know, previously the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British had gone to Ghana to extract a precious metal from the earth, from this African earth. But in the present, we had young Africans extracting precious metals from the waste, from the leftovers of Europe, let's say. So I saw in this a sort of reverse, or kind of something I termed a kind of a reverse neo-colonial mining. So in the times of a sort of neo-colonization of that land, let's say, there was a reversal, which was a kind of a switch in terms of sense of agency, I suppose, for the Ghanaians that were dealing with this waste. And then making that work also then too started to think about how that might relate to ideas of, again, extracting precious metals from the internet, which can be done in different ways. On the one hand, you might have companies like Amazon, for example, that will colonize a very large space within cyberspace, and then that will then be used to accrue capital. So I started to try and think about the internet as this material space, as this landscape within which different things can be excavated, not just wealth, not just gold, but also history can be excavated from the internet, and material, video material. So the film is actually a collage of video material and sound material entirely sourced from the internet, placed in relationship with the images that I filmed of these young guys extracting metals from computers. So I started to try and draw a series of connections between that and then just sort of still thinking about the earth and extraction and my interest in archaeology. Was also trying to think about if we can be excavating history from the internet, could we kind of start to think that the internet itself might. This is actually an idea from a friend of mine who's sitting in the audience, so I will claim that he said it first. It's Olivier Marbeuf, who said to me that perhaps the internet can be it's the new soil. It's the soil. It's the site within which, let's say, culture is actually composting and starting to mulch down into this organic matter, and perhaps within that soil of the internet, different histories, different imaginaries might be generated, might be made possible. So, yeah, I mean, that's something then, well, that only leaves me with a couple of minutes to then continue speaking about how that relates to this work that I made recently called Black Code, Code Noir, which was shown for the last 10 days at Berskova. Did I say it right? You know that big space in central Brussels, just near La Bourse. And this is a work that looked into the relationship between a certain series of murders of young black Americans by the United States Police Force, notably Michael Brown and Kajimi Powell, and then the relationship that might have with histories of social control and domination from the plantation system, looking at the sort of algorithmic structures of the police force in the United States today. And then what that might have in relationship with a history to do with the Haitian Revolution as a form of a sort of assertion of a sense of historic agency by sort of calling back on the past, on these past phantoms. And that film is made almost, I think 99% of the film is made with images from the internet. And again, these are images of, quite common images that we've probably seen a lot of during those times of protest in Ferguson, for example, which were images of people burning cars in the streets, but also images of police brutality against people. And then with that video, the idea was to see how, you know, I could perhaps, again, repurpose those images from the internet to speak of some potential future politics that might, you know, possibly be made with this recalling back of the spirit, let's say, of the Haitian Revolution. That's 8 minutes, I think, yeah. So maybe, so they're two projects that I wanted to present to sort of give you a general idea of things I've been working with.
We can continue more in questions with the audience, and I have some inquiries as well. So we're going to now go on to Basir Mahmoud. Basir is currently at the Rijks Academy. We're very happy to have brought him down here. Basir, when I was thinking about your work, I actually also was reading this fragment where Deleuze talks about storytelling in cinema. And storytelling in cinema is something that involves opposing realities that tear the filmmaker away from a dominant reality. And when thinking about reality and fiction as principles that are not separate but keep moving into each other and become a dynamic, a contagion, I thought of this aspect of what it means when cinema brings out a real character and makes that a form of agency and of invention as well. This condition of invention and of labor within your films is something that I'm very interested in.
I think it was all related to the idea of power. I started to think about, as an artist, what power I have to make work, and also to make somebody do what I want to, like tell my narrative or so. And that I started my, whenever I went out of Pakistan since 2011, I've been traveling mostly for artist residency, and this was my way of understanding what's going on in art. And in residencies, I was kind of, because I was applying for a lot of residencies because I wanted to travel and go out and make work. And I was thinking about, especially that some of the residencies were asking for like community-based projects and something like that. And I started to feel like, you know, they probably place you as a teacher or somewhere above, or you reflect on something, or why. I mean, then I started to think about my position as an artist, you know, what sort of a power I carry, you know, in terms of making work or things like that. And then from onward, I started to think about how do I position myself in terms of a viewer. And that's how I came to the point that I should not act more clever than a viewer. So that's how my work started to become very simpler. To the point that a few days back, somebody sent me an email saying, "Dear Basic." It's meant like very basic. So I was, so when I, after traveling extensively for residencies, 2013, I went back to Pakistan. This is not where my practice is. My practice sort of, I believe, is constantly evolving, is changing by nature. And it's maybe because the kind of process I am in, I think I mostly work as a viewer, and I'm kind of very interested in this moment when you, from an artist, you suddenly become a viewer, like this point when you start to look at your work. And these kind of inquiries really provide me this space, but they prolong this duration when I am behind a camera, is an artist, but also a viewer. So in this particular work, I went, when I was in Pakistan, I was thinking about, I went back and I felt of this very silent observer of my own society. I was thinking about looking at things very differently when I went back. My own family, my friends and my people. So I thought of making very observational, like basic work, like how people interact and things like that. And so I asked somebody if he could invite his relatives and friends and they could have some kind of an event which stays unknown, and I just there and record it. So he sort of becomes an architect of the work, so he decides what they do. But when I placed myself with the camera, I think I sort of broke the structure which I wanted to build on, because I became sort of an alien figure in it. Everybody became sort of uncomfortable, and not just me, but also because of having this camera in front of them, they started to also act that they don't even know each other. So it was a very awkward moment it created. And I started to kind of like it, and I started to, okay, let's go forward with this. And that's how I started this. So from this work, I started onward working with day workers, like in Pakistan, who work for like less than €1 for a day. And I was also struggling with money, and I wanted actors, so I thought, why not to? And we refer to them as unskilled labor. So I thought, okay, I don't also know what narrative I want to build, so it might be great to have my narrative explained by the unskilled people, like who don't know. So I started hiring them for, so I make my work like in having 10 people in €5, like you make a film. This is also like easy way to experiment and make a work. But especially I like those moments. I always go with a plan, you know, this is what I want to do. But when I meet them, so it's kind of a strategy, I meet them on the location. And I like that moment when they completely disregard my narrative. They completely, they don't want, sometimes they are completely uninterested, they don't know what's going on, and they look at me, they look at the camera or whatever. That all becomes part of my work. And again, you know, we talk about documentary as being fiction, but I think for me, in that case, fiction, there's no way I could really achieve a fiction. There's always a moment when actors become themselves. So this kind of, I think, tension which is within the work, which I'm kind of interested in. Yeah.
I think it might help to share the fact that who are non-professional actors, there's this kind of setting that you create, which is often quite simple, but what I sense is that it becomes another system of labor.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of economy of film, where the making of the film invites a kind of labor of perhaps non-performance as well, waiting, repeating, eating, staring, actions that become, in a sense, between becoming self-conscious, but also, in a sense, I don't know, a form of training. Or
I'm interested in all these bigger idea of politics and religion or whatever, but I like to work with them. I break it down to small fragments, to small gestures. Like the work I made, Power Between Week, it's between like, I was thinking about how a week would deal with power. And I work with minorities in Pakistan, just with like Christian community with just 2 persons. And I create this atmosphere where they just continuously stare at each other. So stare at you, and within that they take off their shirts. It's kind of a sort of poetic narrative. But this, I think it's, I just initiate the work, but there are things which happen within the work which interest me more. I was in London and at Guestworks, so I had some funding. I thought I should work with like professional actors, so I hired like 2 professional actors to make a work. And they were so good that became problem for me. They were doing exactly what I wanted them to do. There were moments when they would look at me and ask me what is next, and I didn't know. So it didn't work. So I made the work, but I'm kind of ashamed of it. I didn't show it to anybody. So then I went back to this point where I said, okay, it's better for me to, it's important for me to kind of, in the process of making work, I think not knowing open up more possibilities for me than knowing something. So I like to stay in this point where I'm also floating. Yeah.
We, especially since we started late, I would be very happy for questions at any point. Can possibly start, but please just raise your hands and we'll circulate the mic. So I'm going to start. Judy, I was intrigued by, in your essay within the book 1,000 Eyes that you co-edited, you discuss what you call the geometry of vision, and I would like to possibly go into that a little bit, while also thinking around the lens as a body, because in this sense the gaze of the camera becomes also a style of performance. If we could go into that a bit.
Okay. I'm not sure I can say anything about the lens of the body, but maybe we'll figure it out. The geometry, well, in some really basic way, the camera, we end up with square images usually, or rectangular images, but of course the camera sees in a cone and uses a little hole as an aperture and actually sees a kind of cone of vision, like your eye sees a cone. And so I was in some works interested in this idea that although there is a outer field that exists obviously around the frame of the image, there's also an outer field which is just usually like right beside the camera and all on the way, anything outside this triangle or this cone. So I've used that in some ways and formally, and I guess in other works I've made a connection then between like this sort of geometry or formal organization. So in the World Court I had 7 cameras, each of them basically did a head and shoulders shot, and I was interested in how in the court, many different courts, but I guess most courts, where you sit is who you are, and where you sit is the same thing. You know, switch around, the judge doesn't move around. This sounds obvious, but it's actually like some kind of theatrical convention that when you sit in that place, you are that person, and if you're not that person, you don't sit in that place. And so I wanted to create this kind of rigid sort of camera structure of the head and shoulders shot. But then also always to break my own rules, so that's why the whole apparatus actually turned. And in fact, literally in the court, there's also a problem of at least that one they've now probably made. I haven't been back to the ICC because they were making a purpose-built building. But one of the issues is the person testifying should look at the judge. And if you are probably in the audience, you're sitting behind the person testifying, so you see their back, and it's necessary they look at the judge. So the only time you would see the person testifying is you would see in the camera that the court itself was using. So I wanted this, so they broke their own rule, and they had a spatial kind of break as well. So that's kind of a geometric organization that I had also with the 7 cameras. But I was also interested in the difference between theater, because theater, everyone gets their own eyes mostly, and you sit with your eyes, and you might sit with however many of you there are, 60 of you, and you actually all see something a little bit different because you're actually all coming from a different perspective, quite literally. And that's obviously a big thing in the theater. What's your sight line? Some things don't work. So that mix again between this like quite personal perspective that you have in theater, whereas the camera creates a single perspective for everybody. That's a bit of the geometry that I was interested in. The body of the camera, I don't know.
Thank you. Questions? Right.
Hi. Natasha, I have a question for you. been grappling with this term justice for such a long time. And, you know, it seems one of these concepts that's impossible to define, as it adheres to a kind of a collective belief, you know. But the moment we try to think about it in concrete terms, it seems impossible to actually achieve, and it's this belief that actually acts as a motor for the idea of justice. I published a book last year called Aesthetic Justice, which was looking at how aesthetic frameworks could negotiate a new idea of global justice. But while I was working on the book, I realized that it's actually kind of impossible to talk about justice, and it's easier to talk about injustice. So I have two questions. The first one, how do you define the concept of justice on the one hand, and on the other hand, how will you negotiate to actually talk about the idea of justice instead of injustice?
Great, thanks so much. Good, I'm actually happy to have those questions. Luckily, I'm not going to define justice at any point. What I am grappling with myself is how justice may be seen as a medium that is performative, ethical, and aesthetic. I actually feel that it is a crucial time for us to externalize this term while we move in and out of what it could mean. I believe in collectivity very much, and in fact, I'm glad we talked about the idea of justice as something that requires collective belief, because in fact, just in terms of methodology at least, within the Contour Biennale 8, we are working with a lot of collectives and with a lot of different formats of collaboration. And again, this might, I don't know, appear superficial, but I feel within what we do as curators, I'm very committed to this idea of inviting collective approaches to the moving image and of really grappling through, as I said, the idea of witness and stances of witnessing through the conditions of evidence and how evidence formation takes place outside of the courtroom, in fact, outside of law. This aspirational form in which the trial becomes a form of architecture, becomes an act of staging. I really feel that unless we deal with these aspects collectively through what a biennale is, I think, you know, we, in fact, having worked in a lot of biennales, in any case, biennales can have great titles. Often, the theme becomes the biggest failure. So, I'm perhaps ready for this failure already, but I would rather deal with it up front. There's another question. Sorry, Judy wants to...
No, I was just going to say that it's very interesting, and just the terms are so interesting about, I also don't actually know anything about justice, but I was, people, when I made this court work, I really didn't let there be any like a final judgment. And partly because I didn't want that, but this was often the question, even with people who were like, gee, if I would have stayed for that whole 4 hours, would I have found out if somebody was guilty or not guilty? But for instance, in the case of Milosevic, which was something I was looking at, you know, he died. And a lot of people who worked on that case, I guess, were very upset that their feeling of justice wasn't done. But of course, there wouldn't have been justice anyways, because it seems like the justice and the judgment would also be two different things. And I do think that also the judgment is a very interesting category for art, because maybe we're very judgmental anyways, just to leave it on a simple level. But,
Sorry, that reminded me as well that it's important to say, because you talked about injustice as well. I also have another advisor who I'd like to mention at this point, who's Denise Ferreira da Silva. who's in fact a professor on gender, race, and social justice. So again, it doesn't mean that her knowledge becomes transmitted and we sort of evolve into dealing with this question in a more sophisticated way, but this idea again of sharing knowledge from outside the arts is something that, on this question of injustice, is something I'm keen to do. And the subjects of whether it's the prolonged colonial modernity or questions of racism and hyper-nationalism, etc., I'd rather have these act themselves out than call the Biennale to kind of pronounce itself into injustice, as if that's what we're labeling. And also it's interesting for me that Nicola worked with the term utopia in I felt a very performative dimension that included again trials towards that terminology and its history. So I follow in a sense.
It's good because you have made the link that I wanted to make. It was about utopia, and yeah, I see this edition. It was last year, and well, I think it was interesting concerning the theme, because there was some works of artists which was like in situ. It was a kind of well, there was some site specific, and it was interesting to relate Mechelen and this theme of utopia in terms of history. But there was some other works that was, yeah, I really didn't understand all the time. And I think you mentioned that, yeah, the theme is always a problem in the Biennale. And so I'm asking, maybe it's an interest if this edition will maybe incorporate some, yes, site-specific or work that deals with the story of Mechelen, maybe.
Okay, well, the way in which we are dealing with Mechelen is through this engagement with the Great Council as something that is part of a major history of this land, in a sense. So this was the regional court that for the first time placed itself under the Burgundian Netherlands within the lowlands. It was previously a traveling council. So in a sense, we go from a traveling council that is imparting law and acts of justice, which then decides, let us consolidate ourselves here in this territory and let us act as a regional force across the lowlands in French, Dutch, and German-speaking parts, right? I'm interested in that, not necessarily to celebrate it, because I think we have a lot of problems right now to be then going back into an enlightened European celebration mode, but perhaps, definitely, to also think of what legitimized this action, this place. What kinds of meetings took place there? What are the things that we need to investigate today, in a sense, as that collectivity? So they may not be absolutely literal, but I think the areas I'm exploring come very close to it. I'm also interested in polyphony, as I said, and polyphonic music typifies the idea of collective voicing. And in this sense, this is how allegorically and symbolically as well discuss this. If there are no more questions, I'm going to maybe ask a last question. I don't know how we're doing for time, but to Louis.
Oh, sorry, I was right. I was taking notes.
There's a question I think I already threatened to ask you, which was around the verticality of imaging in this case. So when, in a sense, you go into the mind as this deep space of extraction, of negation, and then there's, in a sense, this cloud that is a floating space, which again goes into another realm of penetration. And I wonder if you could talk about that as a film technique that you use as well.
Yeah, well, it's kind of problematic to even talk about structures of space in that sense, in terms of a verticality of an image, let's say, because actually with these last two works I've made recently, you know, some of the criticisms of them has been very much about their, well, criticisms and their praises on both sides, their flatness. So that they're very flat films, formally, because both, well, especially All That Is Solid is a film that takes place entirely, pretty much, on my desktop, on my computer desktop, made with screen recordings. And somebody actually, you know, brought this interesting question up about this idea of flatness and the flatness of the screen, but that formal aesthetic flatness actually indicates a sort of political and ethical flatness, which was pretty interesting critique of the work, and actually something we kind of, well, sorry, this is an aside, but that Dan and I were just vaguely talking about, that there might also end up being a kind of flattening out of history, and the film in 15 minutes tries to approach a very complex series of connections and questions around colonial history, to do with Ghana, and, you know, and that perhaps there's been a sort of foreshortening, flattening of those histories, and that the film doesn't actually develop, it doesn't go deeper into these histories, it doesn't actually excavate or mine deep enough, it always rests very much on the surface. So to relate this formal flatness to ideas of extraction and penetration of the earth, it's almost as if the practices that I speak about are deep, they go into deep time and deep space, whereas the work that I then make is more panning for gold on the surface, so taking sand and then trying to find the nuggets of gold. You know, that's also a sort of political choice in some respects too, which is about working with the means at hand and about working with, you know, the materials that you have in a sort of immediate sense. So when you're panning for gold, you don't have the resources to dig that deeply into mine for something, but nonetheless there's an urgency for those fragments to be sort of picked up and, you know, and something made from them. And it's the same way that I approach, I suppose, the ways that I want to make these films, is that there's a certain urgency and desire to speak about a topic in this instance now, so I work maybe very much on the surface, trying to pick up fragments of things and then trying to piece them together. And then the thought process often comes after the action too, and then it's more from discussions, from writing, from talks, from, well, the same thing as discussions, that the work becomes deeper and gets more enriched, and then we have more conversations and it kind of extends. And that's something I like to, that I try to do a lot more now, is to try and make a film that can really be a kind of discursive object. So the film itself can exist, you know, as something to be shown, but then maybe it doesn't necessarily work in the sense that it doesn't tell you much in the first reading, in the first experience of it. So then necessarily this needs an elaboration and a sort of thickening out. And just the reason why I say that too is that this gets back to this flattening of the screen, which is, there is a problem with cinema in the sense that you're sort of limited to this flat screen of projection. And I try to sort of now, you know, come out of the screen into a more fleshy 3D or 4D world of kind of dialogue with people. Anyway, that's just like another project, but yeah. But sorry, I didn't talk about verticality at all. But I spoke about geometry and space.
Thank you, everybody, for going through this process. It's not easy sometimes, I think, to do an artist talk while we're so immersed ourselves. We're doing research trips, going into archives and things all day. So I'm very glad that
just to add, yeah, because we've actually had the morning in the Royal Library looking at 16th, very early 16th century manuscripts of polyphonic music, and I can't get that out of my head. So I'm just still sort of grappling with all these sort of polyphonies that we experienced this morning. So we didn't talk about it at all, but that might come up, I suppose, at some point later.
Thank you. All right. right, then we're going to also have more activities on our website, and we're going to have an online journal for Contour this time. So please follow us. We hope to see you again at other events. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Natasha, and the artists for this very interesting and talk and the chance to get to know your practices. There, that's better. Your practices and your thinking moving towards Contour 8. I remind everyone it's in less than 1 year. March 11th is coming soon, and I hope to see you all also on that occasion again. But sooner than that, we have a few things coming up at the Villa that I would also like to share with everyone. The most imminent is in about a few minutes, Sarah Moutalebi's performance, so I hope you can all stay with us. We just need to remove the chairs, time for a drink or maybe a cigarette, and then the performance will begin. Beyond that, there's very soon, May 13th, the public opening of Répétition, which is the first exhibition curated by the artistic director of the Villa, co-curated by Nicolas Lise. Nicolas is also here with us this evening. It's very nice that a lot of the people involved with the Villa in the upcoming events are here these days. And I should mention also Sofia Almaria, who is in residence here at the Villa together with other artists, is part of the program Inhabitation, which is the artist residency program that the Villa has launched, and that is in the process of activating the Villa through performances and choreographies that the residents are doing, will be doing actually, starting with Répétition in sort of impermanent mode during the upcoming exhibitions. And finally, the public program I am working on, which begins May 25th. It's called Oops. If everyone can just be 1 more minute quiet, please, so I can make this announcement. May 25th begins the Embassy of Uncertain Shores. It's a platform for artists and researchers working with the format of lecture performances and happenings, and it very much reflects on the disillusionments of Europe, around Europe today, here in the headquarters also of the embassy neighborhood in Brussels, and of course in Brussels as capital of Europe. So it also connects to the last Contour, which was very much a questioning of the current state of affairs in Europe, and also of the refugee crisis. We have had a collaboration already at the Villa with Cinema Maximilien, which is a pop-up cinema working with refugees in Brussels. And most importantly, the program begins May 25th with the lecture performance series of Slavs and Tatars. It's sort of a retrospective. They're lectures from 2009 till 2016. The last lecture is on October 26th, with a new lecture that they are producing for the Villa. So in the course of about 5 months, we will have once a month these lectures together with an art installation of Slavs and Tatars. So I hope to see you also on the occasion of this program, May 25th, and invite you all to have a drink with us and to stay for the next performance. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thanks again to coming to the